The complete story of Abraham, the father of faith and the eternal promise, a journey of faith and redemption. Before we dive into the story of Abraham, it's important to understand the world in which he lived. After the fall of Adam and Eve, humanity continued to drift away from God. Sin spread, bringing with it pride, violence, and rebellion. Following the Great Flood, people began to multiply again, but they also returned to their rebellious ways. And the most striking symbol of that rebellion was the construction of the Tower of Babel. They wanted to build a tower so high it would reach the heavens, but their goal wasn't to glorify God, it was to glorify themselves. Let's make a name for ourselves, they said. It was human pride in its purest form. So God intervened. He confused their language so that no one could understand one another. The construction stopped, and the people scattered across the earth. This marked the beginning of the dispersion of nations. From that moment on, humanity entered an even darker period. Each group carried with them fragments of the knowledge of God, but over time, those fragments faded. And what remained was idolatry. People began creating gods in their own image, gods with human faces, human desires, and human weaknesses. The world plunged into spiritual darkness, a state of confusion, distance from God, and worship of lifeless images that could do nothing. But in the midst of this darkness, God chose to light a flame. He chose one man, just one, someone who didn't even truly know him yet, but who would become the starting point of a new covenant. That man was Abram, and through him, God would begin writing a new story, a story of faith, of promise, and of redemption. The birth of Abraham and his origins. Abram, that was the original name of the man who would later be known as Abraham, the father of faith. He was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous and highly developed city for its time. Ur was located in the region of Mesopotamia in what is now southern Iraq. It was a place rich in culture, trade, and also filled with gods. Abram was the son of Terah, and his family lived in a completely polytheistic environment, that is, they worshipped many different gods. It was common for people to bow down to idols, build temples, offer sacrifices, and seek protection from deities crafted by human hands. This was the world Abram grew up in. From a young age, he learned to live surrounded by idolatry in a society where faith was far removed from the one true God. And yet, it's in this very setting that something extraordinary begins to unfold. God looks at Abram, a regular man, raised in a pagan culture, and chooses to call him into something completely new. It's as if, in the midst of spiritual darkness, a small light begins to shine. Abraham wasn't perfect, nor was he special in the eyes of the world, but God saw in him a heart willing to obey, to break away from everything he knew, and to begin a brand new story. And that reveals something powerful. God can turn any origin into an eternal purpose. God's call to Abraham. In the midst of a generation steeped in idolatry, surrounded by images, rituals, and belief in many gods, God speaks to Abram. It's a call that changes everything. Without many details, without deep explanations, God simply says, "Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you." Imagine the impact of that command. Abram already had a settled life. He was living in Haran with his family, had wealth, servants, security, and God calls him to leave it all, everything. And the most remarkable part, God doesn't even reveal the final destination. He only promises to show the way step by step. But along with the call, God gives extraordinary promises. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And you will be a blessing. And more, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. This is no ordinary calling. It's the beginning of something much greater. A plan that would span generations. A plan that would point toward the coming of a Savior. And Abram? He obeys, without knowing what lies ahead, without knowing where he'll sleep tomorrow or what challenges he'll face on the road. He simply trusts. This is the birth of true faith, a faith that walks even when it cannot see the path. And that step of faith marks the beginning of the great story between God and the people He chose. The journey of faith and the first challenges. Abram obeyed the call. He gathered his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, the servants, the animals, and set out. No GPS, no map, no fixed destination, just God's promise in his heart. And so begins a journey of faith. But even in the first steps, the challenges appear. The land of Canaan, which God had promised, was already inhabited. And to make things worse, a severe famine struck the region. Abram had to go down to Egypt in search of food. There, afraid he would be killed because of Sarai's beauty, he lied and said she was his sister. A decision that shows that, despite his faith, Abram was still human-prone to failures, doubts, and fears. Even so, God protected him. Even when Abram made mistakes, the Lord responded with grace and mercy. Pharaoh eventually discovered the truth, and Abram was expelled from Egypt, but he left unharmed and even richer than before. After that, he returned to Canaan and built altars to the Lord. It's as if each altar served as a reminder: God is with me, even in my failures, even in the wilderness. And the journey continues. At one point, Abram's and Lot's flocks had grown so large that the land could no longer support them both. To avoid conflict, Abram proposed they part ways and generously let Lot choose first. Lot chose the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley, near Sodom. Abram remained with what was left. But soon after, God spoke to Abram again. Lift up your eyes. All the land that you see I will give to you and your descendants forever. That's the rhythm of walking with God. Challenges, choices, stumbles, but also promises, divine encounters, and a faith that keeps growing. Lot's separation and the corruption in Sodom. After walking together for so long, the time came for Abram and Lot to part ways. Both had become very prosperous. Their flocks, their servants, their tents, everything was growing. But with prosperity came tension between their herdsmen. And once again, Abram showed his character. Even though he was older and the head of the family, he stepped back and said to Lot, "Choose whichever direction you want. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked around and saw the lush green plains of the Jordan Valley. Fertile land, pleasing to the eye, but with a serious problem. That's where Sodom was, a wealthy city, yes, but morally corrupt, a place where sin had become a way of life. Still, Lot chose to go there. He moved closer, pitched his tents, until he was fully immersed in that environment. Meanwhile, Abram stayed in Canaan, and once again, God spoke to him, "Lift up your eyes, look north, south, east, and west. All the land you see, I will give it to you and your descendants, like the dust of the earth, too vast to count. God was expanding Abram's vision. Even though, at that moment, he still had no children, the promise remained strong. And what about Sodom? Its corruption only deepened. It was a city that had rejected God's ways and would soon become the setting for a story marked by judgment, but also by mercy. Lot's choice reminds us of something crucial. Not everything that looks good to the eyes is good for the soul. The War of the Kings and Lot's rescue. The scene now shifts to a time of war. Several kings from the region had joined forces in a massive conflict fighting over territory, power, and control. And in the middle of this battle, Sodom, the city Lot had chosen to live in, was attacked and plundered. Lot and his entire family were taken as prisoners. Once again, Lot's seemingly smart choice revealed its consequences. Now, he was in danger, trapped in the hands of enemies. But someone heard what had happened. A messenger ran to Abram and told him everything. And what did Abram do? Even after separating from Lot, even though he could have said, "That's not my problem anymore," Abram didn't hesitate. He gathered 318 trained men from his household and set out on a bold rescue mission. With a courageous strategy, he attacked the enemy kings at night. And with God's blessing, he won. He recovered all the stolen goods, rescued Lot, his family, and even the people of Sodom. On the way back, Abram was met by two important figures. The first was the king of Sodom, who offered him wealth and reward. But Abram refused and said, "I will accept nothing from you, so that you can't say, 'I made Abram rich.'" The second was a mysterious and sacred figure, Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. He blessed Abram and brought out bread and wine, and in a gesture of honor, Abram gave him a tenth of everything. This episode reveals something powerful. Abram wasn't just a man of faith, he was a man of action, courage, and integrity. Even in the midst of war, he stayed guided by God, rejecting human glory, but embracing divine blessing. And Lot? Even after being rescued, he chose to return to Sodom. That decision would bring more consequences later. But as for Abram, his journey with God was only beginning to shine brighter. The encounter with Melchizedek and the refusal of Sodom's riches. After the unlikely victory over the enemy kings, Abram returned as a true hero. He had risked everything to save Lot. And now, he came back with the captives, the recovered possessions, and the respect of everyone around him. But along the way, something unexpected happens. A king comes out to meet Abram. But he wasn't just any king. His name was Melchizedek, king of Salem, a city that would later become Jerusalem. He was different from all the other kings. He was also a priest of the Most High God, a rare symbol of true faith in a world consumed by idolatry. Melchizedek blessed Abram and declared, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands." And in a gesture of gratitude and honor, Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. That moment was full of meaning. There stood a priest king, acknowledging God's hand in Abram's victory. And there stood Abram, recognizing that his strength and success didn't come from himself but from the Lord. Soon after, another figure appears, the king of Sodom. He tries to reward Abram with wealth and possessions. But Abramonte again does the unexpected. He refuses any kind of payment. He turns down human glory, easy gain, and recognition from men. And he answers firmly, "I will take nothing that belongs to you, not even a thread or a sandal strap, so you can never say, 'I made Abram rich.'" This action reveals something deep about Abram's character. He didn't want to depend on the favors of men. He trusted fully in God's provision. It wasn't just about money. It was about faithfulness, honor, and principles. In this episode, we see a strong contrast. On one side, the king of Sodom, symbol of a corrupted world. On the other, Melchizedek, a figure of blessing, righteousness, and reverence to the Most High God. And in the middle stands Abram, choosing, once again, to walk by faith, even when the easier path seemed to lead elsewhere. The covenant with God and the promise of a son. Abraham had already left everything behind because of a promise, but time went by, and nothing happened. Had God forgotten? It was in that moment of waiting and doubt that God appeared to Abraham in a vision, and once again, he renewed his promise. "You will have a son, Abraham, and your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky." Abraham looked up. The starry sky seemed endless, and even though he couldn't see how it could possibly happen, he believed. And God was pleased with his faith. That was when God made a covenant with Abraham, a sacred pact, sealed by a ritual that showed the promise was firm, real, and eternal. The birth of Ishmael. But the waiting continued, and with it came anxiety. Sarai, Abraham's wife, now old and still childless, began to wonder, "Maybe the promise needs a little help from me." So she made a bold decision. She offered her servant, Hagar, so that Abraham could have a child with her. Hagar became pregnant, and Ishmael was born. But what seemed like a solution brought tension, jealousy, and conflict into the household. Hagar suffered, Sarai felt rejected, and Abraham was torn. Still, God cared for them all, and he promised that Ishmael too would have a future. But he made it clear the promised child was still to come and would be born of Sarai. Name, change, and the covenant of circumcision. Then God appeared to Abraham again, and this time something special happened. God changed his name. From Abram, which meant exalted father, he became Abraham, father of many nations. Sarai also received a new name, Sarah, which means princess. It was as if God was saying, "You are not defined by who you were, but by what I will do in you." And to seal this new chapter, God established a visible sign, circumcision, a symbol of the everlasting covenant between God and the people who would come from Abraham. It was a reminder that the promise did not depend on human strength, but on divine faithfulness. The destruction of Sodom and Abraham's intercession. Soon after, God revealed something serious to Abraham. Sodom and Gomorrah had become so corrupt that their destruction was inevitable. Abraham, moved by compassion, interceded. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city, Lord? Will you destroy the righteous along with the wicked?" And God answered, "If there are 50, I will spare the city." Abraham pressed on. 40, 30, 20. What if there are only 10? God listened to every request. Abraham wouldn't stop because his nephew Lot and his family were there. It was a deep conversation between a man and his God, marked by faith, courage, and mercy. In the end, there weren't enough righteous people, but Lot was spared. It was yet another sign that God's justice is always accompanied by grace for those who love Him. Isaac is born, the son of the promise. After so many years of waiting, it finally happened. Sarah, now elderly, heard something that once seemed impossible: laughter. But this time, not the laughter of doubt, it was the sound of joy. She had given birth, a boy, a miracle. His name? Isaac, which means laughter. The impossible had become reality. The promise, which once felt so distant, was fulfilled at the right time, God's time. The birth of Isaac was more than just the arrival of a child. It was the beginning of a great nation. A sign that God always keeps his promises, even when everything around says otherwise. The final test, the sacrifice of Isaac. But Abraham's journey of faith wasn't over yet. God then made a request, one that seemed impossible to accept. "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a sacrifice." Abraham's heart was heavy, but he obeyed. In silence, he climbed the mountain with his son by his side. Isaac carried the wood, Abraham carried the fire and the knife. And when everything was in place for the unthinkable, God stopped him. "Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy." It was only a test of faith and obedience. God wanted Abraham's heart, not Isaac's blood. A ram appeared, caught by its horns in a bush, and there, in place of the son, the sacrifice was made. It was more than a test. It was a prophetic foreshadowing of what would happen centuries later with another father and another son. The death of Sarah and Abraham's final days. Time went on. Sarah, the woman who once laughed at the impossible and lived to see the promise fulfilled, passed away. Abraham mourned her, and with love and honor, he bought a field to bury her, the first piece of the promised land he truly owned. After that came another act of care. He made sure Isaac would marry a woman of faith, and so Rebekah became part of the story. Abraham lived many more years and began to see the first fruits of the promise take root. When he died, he was buried beside Sarah, and his story was forever marked as the beginning of something far greater, a journey of faith that would span generations. Final message: faith, redemption, and a prophetic act. Abraham's life wasn't perfect. He had doubts, made mistakes, and faced fears. But he always returned to God, and he trusted. That's why he's still remembered today as the father of faith. His story points to something greater, to someone greater. Isaac's sacrifice replaced by a ram was a foreshadowing of what was to come. Jesus, the Lamb of God who would give himself in our place. Abraham saw it from afar and believed. His journey teaches us that faith isn't about having all the answers, it's about trusting, even when it doesn't make sense, and that God always fulfills what he promises. Conclusion and final reflection. What can we learn from Abraham's story? Abraham's journey is more than just an ancient story. It's an invitation, a calling. He lived in a dark time, full of idolatry, injustice, and confusion. And yet, God called him, and he answered with faith. Abraham left everything behind: his land, his family, his sense of security. He followed a promise, even without knowing exactly where it would lead. Along the way, he stumbled, he doubted, he tried to help God, but he never gave up. He learned that true faith isn't about being flawless, it's about trusting even in the midst of our flaws. His life was marked by one certainty: God is faithful. Abraham teaches us that faith begins with a single step, even when the path is unknown. Obedience may come at a cost, but it's always worth it. God never forgets the promises He makes, and that everything, even the hardest tests, has an eternal purpose. He wasn't perfect, but He was available, and that was enough for God to make Him the father of a great nation and a lasting example of faith. May Abraham's story inspire you to trust, to follow, to obey, even when it doesn't make sense. Because in the end, God always fulfills what He promises. Did you like this content? If this video helped you, share it with someone who also needs to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more videos like this one. And don't forget to leave your likes and comments below. May God bless you and your family. See you in the next video. Thank you so much.